Right, well, we're all extremely lucky here because in Visby are two visiting swordsmiths, stars of the swordsmithery world. We have here immediately to my left, we have Peters Lyon, not Lyon, I've just been corrected on that. And to his left, we have Peters Johnsson.
Yes.
And he runs a company making swords just outside Uppsala, is that right?
Mm-hmm. I am the sole worker at that company. So my company is actually named Ardeo, although very few people know that.
Oh, right.
Because my swords are sold under my name, Peter Johnsson. Ardeo means I am burning in Latin.
Ah, right.
But Peter Johnsson swords are, yes, that's me making them.
Okay, so how does one go about becoming a swordsmith? I imagine you're both fully qualified, you've got degrees in swordsmithery from the University of Swordsmithing.
Yes.
Is that right?
No.
Yes. No. There is no such thing. No such thing.
Yeah. On paper, I'm not qualified to do anything.
Oh.
No. So all I can say is that I've been making swords for over 30 years. That's my qualification.
I'd say that's pretty good, yeah.
And also the big thing is, I'm still making a living at it. And I guess that's a qualification in itself.
Of sorts, yes. I mean, I started out as a children's books illustrator.
Right.
With the graphical designer into the mix. And in a way, it's been a really great help for me in my work as a swordsmith, because it focuses you on style and line, proportion, and also on the process of design. The work of the graphical designer is really just a modernized version of the medieval scribe. You're working on design grids, you're working with sizes of letters in a proportional system. This is a very, very medieval take in design.
Right.
In the setting we are right now, it's a very nice example of 3D typography, if you like.
Yes, there's a lot of geometry in the cathedral.
And this has been a great asset for me in working in that. I've been looking at the sword also from the perspective of design concept, not just functional or craft or material, but also there are aspects in the making of the sword that comes down to ideas of design, which is a static visual language that has also elements of narrative in them. And this is an important part of the sword that is very commonly just passed by without noticing.
So you're talking about design, and yet if you're making authentic medieval weapons, you might imagine that you'd be just copying existing designs, but that's not what you see yourselves doing.
Well, in part, yes. But to copy an existing design, you have to be aware it is a design. And that is usually taken for granted, that you see a sword and, well, that's it, what's there to be seen. But if you have 5 swordsmiths and all of them get to document one single original and then make a replica of that, I can promise you will have 5 very different swords. And all of them will claim, well, this is an exact replica of that sword, because they have all brought different things with them looking at that sword.
And even if they look the same, they won't behave the same.
Exactly.
And that's another thing too, is that we are very, most people today are very focused on looking at the sword as an object and not understanding that, okay, it looks, 2 swords that may look the same may handle differently. And that only matters if you're using it as a fighting weapon. And of course, we don't do that anymore. So that's something we'd lost, and that it's very hard to understand without actually having done it.
Right, although there are HEMA people now who will go in for competition, some of them fiercely competitive, particularly in Sweden it seems, and something can give them a 0.01 of a second advantage, then the balance will...
Yeah, the problem I have with that, if you want to call it a problem, is that it's the sportification of anything. The sword was always there for one purpose, killing people. That was it. That was its ultimate purpose. They were used in tournaments as well. You had blunted versions for tournament combat where you weren't expecting people to be injured or killed, but ultimately the sword was only really good at killing people. It didn't have any other purpose. So anytime you sportify it, you are still moving away from that. And HEMA people, or say the Battle of Nations, where they're trying to win competitions, you're turning it into a sporting contest. You expect to walk away from it. But, you know, to get injured is really should be unusual and bad news.
There is a difference. I do think that there is among HEMA people there is an understanding to varying degrees that what you do is a safe play version of the lethal origin of the art. And you can take that understanding into your competition by perhaps setting up different rule sets or stressing different aspects in the sword play. But it's bound to be a difference. And recently there's been a little bit of a trend to do free play with sharp swords because they do bind in a different manner than a blunt edge does. And of course that implies a high level of danger. You have to be really aware of what you're doing, and just that thing will change other aspects. You will have to have perhaps a little bit more of a safe distance, perhaps some other features or elements that still keeps it safe. But however, what it boils down to is that you have to approach it from many different angles to get an idea of what it's about. And the central element to this, of course, us being swordsmiths, is the sword. So if it's a training sword, if it's a sharp cutting sword, any of these can be sportified. You can make a mass cutting sword par excellence that will be very, 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 very kind to your performance, but it might not be really close to what the original swords were. Likewise, you can make a fencing sword that's really good at winning competitions, but doesn't really handle like a long sword anymore.
For safety, obviously, apart from those free bouting with sharps, we've got to use blunt weapons. As soon as you make a blunt weapon, you've got to decide what's your compromise. Are you going to try and keep it looking like the original, but knowing that you've got a thick blunt edge that makes the dynamics quite different? Or do you say, I will close my eyes and I will go for a sword that feels and behaves as much as possible like the original, even if I have to change the blade itself to keep the feel. So there's always a compromise, and the only no compromise is this idea of a free bouting with sharp swords. And of course that is another compromise, because both the people presumably involved in that want to walk away from that bout.
Oh yes,
so they're limiting themselves too, in the fact that they know they're playing with dangerous weapons. Of course, I'm sure it will bring a focus that would be missing otherwise. And in fact, it would probably be a perfect replica of a medieval duel, but not necessarily medieval warfare, for example.
Right, yes.
So it's always, what is your compromise? That's the question of what is the compromise you're accepting for any given situation that you're creating. And every time you create a rule set, you'll have people that will be there to play the game, and then you'll have other people that will be there to play the rules to win. And that's something that in jousting as well, I've encountered this, that it's the mindset that the people come to it with. You'll have some people who say, I don't care if I lose this bout as long as I feel that I have done service to the people that I'm following with this, and followed the ideal. And you'll have other people who are there of, I want to win, so what can I use in the rules to give myself an advantage?
I've heard those called the athlete, the guy who wants to win, and the validator, who's there to see if the techniques from the treatises work, and if you can get that particular move to work just once, even though he loses the bout, but I got a perfect Schwarzau in the second round or whatever.
And then he knows it works. I did what the people 500 or 600 years ago were doing, and it worked for them as well.
You talked about how the sword was just for killing people, but surely by the time you get to the late medieval period, when people are wearing plate in battle, you cannot cut through a decently...
That's one. Armor is very good at what it's supposed to do. That is protect you.
Unfortunately, we've got a very skewed view of things today, and unfortunately, I have to blame the film industry largely for that.
I think you should blame the film industry.
Hello, I work in the film industry, and it's the one thing I really dislike about the film industry in general is it's terrible at portraying armour doing its job. The idea that you could do a draw cut on somebody wearing mail and they fall over because it's gutted them. Well, no, that's what the armour was there to prevent.
And they die instantly, don't they?
Silently. And silently. There's none of this nasty, this distracting screaming and squirting of blood and all the things that would really have happened. They just move out of frame and quietly die.
Yes, I think there's this idea that the Errol Flynn flicking a sword around
Yes.
looks great.
Try doing that, and you try doing that with a 3-pound sword, and you very quickly realise, yes, it works for a modern fencing foil, which is what Errol Flynn and co. learned with. You try applying that to a medieval long sword, and it simply doesn't work. The dynamics are totally different.
That brings us to using as sword-like as possible props for a film, like what you see in Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
I mean, the swords you made, of course, there's always a slight difference between a sharp sword and a blunt sword. Just because of that extra mass in the edge, it might seem insubstantial, but it's where the mass counts, which is in the outer edges and forward to the point of the blade. If you would have a fully sharp version and the blunted version, you would recognize the difference. There is absolutely a difference, and that is unavoidable. However, you can come close. So it's a lot about what happens in the third dimension, that is the thickness of the blade. And the edges are meant to be thin, and the moment you make them safe, you have changed something on a fundamental level. You can see this in films. You can recognize if a sword is made of aluminum or plastic, because it will move like a piece of plastic or aluminum. But a proper and well-balanced steel sword will behave differently, also in motion.
But because the motion of a steel sword, because it has significantly more mass, if you're doing a movement, the sword draws your hand with it. If you've got an aluminium bladed sword, you can do things like this. That simply, if you do that with a steel sword, will probably hurt your wrist. And the worst of all, of course, are the trend now towards digital.
Yes,
work.
there's no mass
so if you're
there at all.
But also, if
Exactly.
you're in front of a green screen, you may not need a sword at all. They can completely create a digital sword. In which case, you may be using a stick which has no mass at all, and then you can do things that are just totally impossible with any sort of reality mass sword.
Lindybeige!